Ask pretty much any hardcore tournament bass angler what bait wins more tournaments than anything else, especially for smallmouth. And most will tell you it's probably a tube. But here's the truth. Most anglers have lost complete confidence in the tube. They'll tie one on, drag it around for a bit, and they're off chasing that next trend, whatever they think is winning tournaments. Meanwhile, the anglers who know how to fish a tube are quietly stacking giant bags and winning some major money in tournaments. I personally have won more money fishing a tube and dragging it on the bottom than anything else I've ever fished. I'm going to show you all the styles of tubes, all the ways we rig those tubes, and even how we retrieve the tube to get those big fish to choke it. The reason it works so well is it imitates pretty much everything along the bottom, whether it's a goby, a crawfish, could be a leech. Doesn't really matter what they think it is imitating natural forage that they're feeding on. The biggest pain point for most anglers is they think a tube is old school, but really they just don't know how to fish them effectively. I'm going to show you how to get the most out of a tube. So when most people think about a tube, they think about the original, fat tube. These were really designed to imitate a goby or a crawfish. They're generally fairly thick, double dipped, so they're thicker. They got a lot of thick strands. Over the years, the smaller mini tube has become super popular. And really when people think of tubes, these are your generic, pretty much do everything tubes for most anglers. And they just figure out, what size they want to go with and also what color the fish are eating that day. Now, some anglers have figured out that smaller or thinner tubes actually work better in clear water or when there's more pressure. This was really just an evolution of the original thicker tube. Now here at Great Lakes Finesse, we've always loved fishing tubes. And recently we decided to take tube fishing to the next level and introduce the juvie craw, which is the perfect imitator of a little juvenile crawfish that those fish are feeding on most lakes. Over the years, because we've been fishing tubes for so long, we've learned so many things that we like about tubes and also the things that kind of suck about tubes. When we designed our Mini Pro tube head, which has become our top selling terminal tackle at Great Lakes Finesse, and for good reason, we wanted to make a tube with it as well, which is the juvie craw. I'm going to talk about both. The tube head, the Mini Pro tube head, and now we've got the micro mini tube head, which is this little guy here. And I'll get into that in a bit. What makes this tube head so unique is the thicker gauge hook for a mini tube. We're finding we're downsizing more, but more importantly is the sit-up fat head design. What this does is allows any tube you're fishing to sit up and keeps that hook point from rolling over as much while you're pulling it over rocks and hard bottom. So you're getting less snags and you're also getting better hookups because that hook point's sitting up. So it's going to get fish in the roof of the mouth where you're getting the most meat and you're more likely to land fish. Now, when it comes to the juvie craw, we incorporated a flat bottom into that bait, which is going to help maintain the natural fighting position. Those claws are going to lift. Those tentacles are going to lift a little bit. It's got matte finish. Most people don't realize, but stuff underwater is not shiny, and having that matte finish really makes a difference. And that tube head pairs perfectly with the juvie craw. It sits perfectly, and you're going to get incredible hook sets. So most anglers think, man, I got to go out there. These fish are eating gobies. There's gobies in the lake. The reality is, and this is kind of a sneaky tip, we often try to not imitate gobies. There are times that they can work, but if you think about it, these fish are constantly surrounded by gobies. They litter the bottom of the lake. Trust me, if all they wanted to eat was gobies, we would never catch a fish again because they would have enough food that we'd never be able to imitate as closely. And that's why we believe having a juvie craw profile really makes a difference. They can't catch craws as easily as they can catch gobies. And I believe that they like eating, small little craws a lot better, especially when you get into these really small juvenile size craws. The shells are a lot softer. They're easy to digest. And we found that the smaller profiles often get more bites than the bigger profiles. Think about this. If you were a fish and you're surrounded by gobies all the time, to them, they can eat them anytime. They're easy prey to catch. They're probably like hot dogs to them. But then if you throw them, a juicy juvenile crawfish, tastes better, it's different. to me, I believe that's their version of a steak. As humans, we don't like eating the same thing every day. It's the same thing with those fish, and especially something they can eat at will anytime. They probably lose interest in eating that stuff. So when it comes to sizing has really evolved over the years. It was nothing for us, 20 years ago to throw, a 3.5 inch, 4 inch, even a 5 inch tube and get a lot of bites. We've found that over the years, as tube fishing has become super popular, people are dragging more baits on the bottom, and just in general, the fishing pressure that these lakes are getting, going down to a smaller tube has really made a difference. That's why we've got these juvie craws in these smaller profiles. That even includes the 2-inch juvie craw, which is super stealthy. Now, when it comes to picking sizes, it doesn't hurt to occasionally throw in the larger sizes. We have found that the smaller profiles get more bites. As you can see, we've got different colors of tubes. Color is pretty important. Oftentimes, the water is going to dictate which color we go with. If you think about things on the bottom, they're definitely not trying to stand out, and they're trying to really blend in. So the first tip I would suggest is when you get to the lake, look at the water clarity, and it almost goes against the grain because you want those fish to see what you're throwing, but matching the color of your tube to the water, I have found, is the best for getting the most bites. The fish feel like they're finding the bait rather than the bait calling the fish. It's way more natural. There are times where we'll throw a reaction color, especially if we're around some weed or we feel like, it's warm, maybe it's windy. A reaction bait, jerked or, cracked can have a big impact. But I would say for the most part, you're trying to go super natural, match the color of the forage. If there's gobies, then you could go with like a goby color. In this case, we got a juvie craw that's kind of got a goby color. The Mat 309 is an excellent goby imitator, even though it's a craw. These fish don't have brains like ours. They can't process and go, well, that shouldn't be that color. If they're keyed in on those natural colors in other baits in the body of water, they're likely going to bite the same colors in different profiles. So generally match the color of the water and try to match the color of the forage. You're probably wondering why there's so many variations of green pumpkin orange. What's really interesting about crawfish is they'll actually change colors several times throughout the year. That's why you're going to see a lot of different colors out there on the market. Your job is to try to figure out what stage they're at, what color, you're trying to match. If you've got a lake, you get to the bowl launch with some rocks. Oftentimes, if I can, I'm going to flip some rocks over, see if I get a glimpse of a craw. That's going to give me a hint. Or you're just going to need to cycle through different colors throughout the day until you figure out which one they want to bite the most. All right, so depending on the size of tube you're going with, you're going to want to choose a tube head insert, which essentially looks like this. And the most important thing is figuring out what length of hook, so gauge. So whether it's a size 1 hook or a 3/0 hook, it's all going to depend on the length of your tube. So say you've got a 3-inch tube, you're probably going to want a 2/0 hook or a 3/0 hook. If you've got a juvie craw, for example, you're going to want a 1/0 tube insert. Or if you got, say you're using a little 2-inch profile or a really small tube, that's when like even a size 1 tube head will come into play. So matching up the length of the hook and where that you want, basically what you're trying to do is get the hook to come out right at the edge of where the main body of the tube finishes. So that's generally rule number 1. Rule number 2 is then deciding on what insert style you're going to go with, and depending on the action of the tube. So if you're looking to swim a tube or you want a spiraling action, you can go with like a darter head. The most common tube head for most regular tubes is just your cylinder style tube. Again, you want to pick a hook length that's appropriate and a quality hook. If you're dragging on the bottom, I believe in having something that's going to allow your hook point to stand straight up. That's where the Mini Pro tube head comes into play and is the most effective for rigging a small mini tube, whether it's a 2.5-inch tube, 2.75, a 2.5, like 2.25. That's when your regular size Mini Pro tube head is going to come into play. And then if you need to get down to, we're starting to play with really small tubes, like little crappy size tubes or this 2-inch juvie craw, then you're going to want to go with a micro mini tube head, which again has that size 1, but still a thick gauge hook. You don't want something that's going to bend out. For years, we really didn't have many options, so we were using these little football heads, but the wire on these smaller heads, especially when you get into the crappy size baits, they're just too small and they bend out really easily. You want to be able to you really want to be able to set that hook hard on those tubes, and you don't want your hook to bend out. If you're looking for some additional rattle in your tube, so say you're fishing a 3-inch tube, 3.5-inch tube, you can opt for, there are tube heads on the market that have rattles in them. That could be an option. The other sneaky thing that we do is if we want to add scent to our tube, we'll often use cotton balls, and we'll stick a rattle in there with the cotton ball, scent that cotton ball up. That's going to slowly disperse scent. We've done stuff to make the bait fall slower, like using earplugs and stuffing them in the bottom of the tube. What makes a tube so cool is that there's hundreds of different ways to rig it, and we're still learning every day, and we're always experimenting with stuff. We even used to try trailer hooks and stuff before we realized that getting the right hook and hook diameter was important. So fish a tube, lots to experiment with there, but that's the way you want to rig a tube. And for our juvie craw, the Mini Pro tube head is the best one, and you just want to match the length of the juvie craw with the tube head you're using. In some cases, you're going to see tube heads on the market that have a fat head. That's generally when people are trying to get a goby head profile, so it'll actually expand the head of the tube and give it a bit of a bulge. So a lot of different options out there. But yeah, the Mini Pro tube head also gives your tube that little bit of bulge if you're trying to be a goby or you're trying to be a little craw. So here is probably one of the most important and most overlooked tips I can give you for choosing the right, tube head. Find one that's got the perfect amount of space between the lead and the line tie. Basically what you want ideally is for the thickness of the tube to take up half of the line tie. Meaning, if you look at this juvie craw, the plastic pretty much only leaves enough where you can just get your line through there. What that's gonna do is gonna reduce the amount of gunk that gets caught here, especially when you're dragging a tube along the bottom. There's a lot of just mushy stuff down there, vegetation, mud, just pieces of grass. If you've got a tube head where that eye just sticks way out there, it's not hiding as well as it could be, but most importantly, it's picking up gunk early in your retrieve, and you've now wasted time bringing that bait throughout that cast to the boat. Fish just do not like any kind of debris or buildup on the eye of your tube. Now, if you're around vegetation, a sneaky way to fish a juvie craw, and actually we had already released this bait and we thought we had a really good solution on how to rig this. There's 2 ways now that I've learned to rig the juvie craw weedless. So if you're around grass or around super snaggy cover. So the first way is to bury the head. There's just enough material at the top that you can actually bury the hook in there. Now, what we've learned over the last even year, working with our pros, is that if you take your tube head and you just put it right into the cavity, so you don't worry about burying anything, just stick it right into the cavity. Now, it's completely covered, but if they bite on it, because it's thinner up here, if you get a bite, that hook is going to push right through and get them every time. So sneaky way to fish the juvie craw and make it weedless. So when it comes to rod and reel setup, I'll be the first to admit that it took me years to really figure out what works the best. I used to believe in whippier rods, light line, it's super finesse. And I've talking to some of my friends who are accomplished tournament anglers and getting tips from them and then trying things myself, I've learned that actually having a stiffer rod makes a massive difference. So for most of our tube fishing, I would say 95% of the time, we're going to opt to use, in this case, it's the Finesse CX rods that we've developed, but this is a 7/8 medium heavy rod. It's got a fast action tip. So what that means is it's going to give you a lot of backbone. You're going to be able to long bomb your tube a mile with that stiffness and length. But also what we've found is a lot of our bigger bites come pretty much in the first 5 to 10 feet of our retrieve, whether the bait's falling or it's hit the bottom, moved a foot or two, and those bigger fish grab it. Having that extra length and beef allows us to not only stick those fish at long range, but also control them, especially smallmouth. The first thing they do when when you stick them with a tube is they're going to come to the surface, in some cases jump up to 4 feet in the air. And this allows you to be able to turn that fish and keep them from just having free will and using that leverage to throw your tube head. You're going to be able to turn their head, bring them back down, in some cases even prevent them from jumping. And if you can survive that first jump, that's half the battle. Now, when it comes to the reel that we're going to go with, generally we're going to go with a 2500 or a 3000 spinning reel with a really good drag. We use typically 8 to 10 pound test braid, but the most important part is your leader. So depending on the bottom, if you're on sand or soft bottom, you can get away with like 6 or 8 pound test fluorocarbon leader. Most of the time, especially when we're fishing on these Great Lakes in the north around rocks or zebra mussels, so we're actually going up to 10 or 12 pound test fluorocarbon. Generally, that's about as heavy as we'll go. And we find with the stiff rod, the thicker braid, this thicker leader, and these thicker gauge tube heads. So this Mini Pro tube head has a thicker gauge hook. It's not going to bend out. We're able to just give them, as much power as we need to and control that fish from the moment we hook up all the way till we get them in the boat. So when it comes to retrieving a tube, this is where the small details really matter. I feel like dragging a tube is probably the most effective way to fish a tube when the situation allows, meaning you got hard bottom, you got sand, there's not much weed, and you're able to pull the bait through the bottom of the water, like drag it over the bottom without getting snagged too much or getting, too much stuff on your bait. Now, I like to visualize what the bait's doing and think I'm either a goby if I'm imitating a goby, or if I'm trying to imitate a craw, I want to think like I want to be the craw or be the goby when I'm down there. I know that sounds really silly, but I'll make a cast. Let's do the goby example. I'll make a cast. I'm not going to impart much action into that tube. I'm just going to let it fall to the bottom. Gobies by nature, they don't swim or swim slow. They dart and then they stop. They dart and they stop. So in that case, if I feel like they're eating gobies, I'm going to just impart small little actions as I make that retrieve, but I'm going to pause. At times, I might pause 5, 10, 15 seconds because those gobies will just sit there. And then I'll twitch it once, and then, that's generally when you get a fish to bite. So they're sitting there, their nose down on it, and that quick movement is going to trigger them. Now, if I'm imitating a craw, in that case, I'm going to impart pretty much a steady retrieve with the odd pause. I'm envisioning that craw just kind of crawling over the rocks, moving around. Generally, when you see a craw, they're either sitting there or they're just crawling slowly. So I'll move the bait, using my rod tip, a foot, 2 feet, maybe it's, depending on the day, maybe it's a few inches. Or sometimes I'll even just steadily retrieve with my reel, and that's what will trigger them. So if I'm trying to be a craw, I want to think like a craw, behave like a craw, and impart that exact action. So a really sneaky way to fish the juvie craw that we've learned is to swim it. So most people, when they think about swimming baits, they're thinking about minnows or other kind of just imitating other baits that swim through the water column. But crawfish will also swim too. And we found where those fish are suspending, there is an opportunity to show them something they've never seen before and get them to bite. This spring, we had an incredible day realizing those fish were keyed on stuff off the bottom. They're somewhat suspended. We stopped dragging the juvie craw and we started to swim it. So how do we swim it? What we do is we cast it way out there and we just reel it back. Almost think about like the jig and the minnow technique that's so hot right now. All you're doing is cast it out, reel it back, and you're twitching your rod tip and having a straight cadence retrieve. The bait will actually swim like this. It looks like it's trying to get away. And those fish just think, wow, I just found this this craw that's in such a vulnerable state, I don't need to dig through rocks to get one. What an easy meal. So a really sneaky but effective way to use a craw imitating tube. So when it comes to speed of your retrieve, what I've kind of learned over the years is in just fishing tournaments, talking with friends, and again, we're always learning, but when the bite is hot, when the fish are in a real good mood to eat, speeding up your retrieve often works best. Whether it's, cracking the tube, which is you let it fall and you crack it with your rod tip, make it dart and then spiral down, or if you're dragging it, just drag it faster. You might use you might cast and then your retrieve dragging along the bottom is only a minute, 2 minutes for the entire cast, like 120 feet. Now, when the water's cold or there's a lot of pressure on the lake, I find going super slow is the best. Most anglers do not have the patience to fish a tube slow. And when I mean slow, I mean so painfully slow where it might take you 10 minutes to bring that tube back to the boat on one cast. I'm not joking. There are times where I'm literally counting the rocks as I'm bringing that back. I'll move it a couple inches, stop. Move it a couple inches, stop. Sometimes I'll let it sit there. There are times as well where if there's a lot of people around, those fish are on a piece of structure or you feel really confident that they're there, sometimes we'll let it sit there for a minute or two without even moving it. We learned this because we used to fish spots that we get a lot of, there's a lot of fish on, say, a hump, and we'd break off. We'd get snagged, we'd break off. There have been times where that tube is just sitting there because it's broken off and we've caught another fish in the school and it's actually got the tube that we broke off in its mouth. We could have caught that fish if we were just letting the bait stay and just sit on the bottom. It's something that nobody does and will help you catch more fish. Now, when I'm talking about, that really subtle presentation and slow retrieves, that's when I find the juvie craw really shines. The technology built into the juvie craw, this thing has floating claws and floating tentacles. It looks much more natural than your standard tube. So when you're fishing it really slow and they're getting a good look at it, either doing little hops with it or letting it dead stick and letting those claws just lift. Sometimes I'll even just try to impart the slightest vibration in the bait where I call it moving it without moving it. And that's when you're just trying to get the bait to rock back and forth. Oftentimes, especially if we can see them on forward facing sonar, we know they're looking at it. That's what will trigger these bites. Okay, so I've gone through a lot of stuff here, the shapes, the tubes, the actions to get you those bites. So now what do you do when you get a bite? I've learned a lot over the years and I've lost a lot of fish. And the system that I find works the best is having that medium heavy, that stiffer action rod. When you get that bite, you want that drag to be set reasonably stiff where, you're pretty much to the point where if you set the hook into the bottom, it's still going to give way without breaking. So that's kind of the magic sweet spot, is where you think you can get it to the point where the line won't break. I hit them as hard as I can. If I get a hook, say I get a bite, I'll wait for the fish to load up a little bit. And what I mean by load up is, say you're dragging the bait, watch your rod tip. You'll see it kind of like bend a little bit, and then you'll feel the fish actually running with it. It's key to let that fish take it for, a few seconds and feel that fish kind of, I call it loading up, to make sure they have it. At that point, you're going to want to sweep as hard as you can. That's where I really like the Mini Pro tube head, because it's got that beefier hook. It's also short shank, so it's not going to have as much leverage to throw the fish. Now, when you're reeling the fish in, a lot of people will think instinctually to lift their rod tip. I actually do the opposite. I put my rod tip as close to the water. In a lot of cases, especially if I'm in a tournament and I've got a big fish on the line, I'm going to stick my rod tip in the lake as far as I can. That's where that length comes in too. Not only are you getting the distance, but you're getting a 7-8 foot rod. So now I'm able to drive my rod down in the water, 7 feet plus, and that's going to keep that fish from jumping multiple times. You're able to actually, if you start to feel them come up, you'll kind of get a sense of them. They'll start to come up, drive your rod right down, even into the water, reel as hard as you can to turn their heads so they can't jump. Then when you get to the side of the boat, this is where most anglers totally screw up. They get impatient. They start to pull hard on that fish. Keep in mind, you don't know where that hook is in their mouth. So I always try to give them time when they're around the boat. They've got their jumps out of the way. They're kind of digging under the boat. At times, I'll even adjust my drag. If you don't know how to do this really well, don't mess with your drag. But if you do, you can lighten your drag a little bit. Let that fish dog beside the boat and don't give it any more pressure than you were when you're actually fighting the fish. If you got a buddy who is there and can net them, wait for that fish to come up, show its head, and always scoop the fish head first. You never want to fish, or you never want to land or net a fish by tail. You always want to go for their heads and wait for it to be at the surface. So those are some tips. Those are the ways I fight fish and have had a lot of success. You know, like I said, I've won a lot of money in tournaments fishing a tube. It's not necessarily because I'm getting more bites. I do believe the system, the way I fight those fish, allow me to land more fish than my competitors and give me that extra 1 or 2 fish I need in the day to win. So when should you choose a juvie craw versus a regular tube? We still fish both. We love mini tubes, especially, you know, the 2.5, 2.75 size down to even a 2-inch. And the juvie craw comes in those finesse sizes as well. I find that I usually try to go with a juvie craw first. The reason being is if they're biting that, usually the bite's pretty hot. At times, if I'm, you know, just trying to switch it up, maybe I've caught a few fish in the school, I'll throw the regular tube and pick up a few extra bites. Most of the time, you know, if there's one fish, there's others. And if a few of them have seen their other buddies get caught on one profile, you know, switching up the profile can allow you to catch a few more fish out of the school. So now you've got what you need to be a master at tube fishing. I hope you liked this video. If you got value out of it, I'd love for you to like and subscribe, join our community. This is just one of many of the videos in our Finesse Boot Camp series. So check out those other videos, and we're excited to have you come along and learn with us.